It was a quiet, unremarkable night in the small town of Fairview, the kind where nothing ever seemed to happen. The stars hung still in the sky, and the usual suburban hum had long faded into silence as families retreated into their homes. In a modest two-story house on the edge of town, 6-year-old Emily Reynolds had gone to bed like she did every night, tucked under her pink blanket with her favorite stuffed rabbit by her side. Her mother had kissed her forehead, whispered good night, and closed the bedroom door softly behind her, leaving it open just a crack, as Emily always liked. There had been no signs of distress, no cries, no strange noises. Just the gentle creak of the house settling into its nighttime slumber. By all appearances, everything was perfectly normal, until morning came. At dawn, the sunlight filtered gently through Emily's lacy curtains, illuminating an empty bed. Her mother, Margaret, was the first to notice. When she peeked into the room to wake her daughter for school, her heart dropped into her stomach. The sheets were rumpled, the stuffed rabbit on the floor, and Emily was gone. No signs of a struggle. No open windows or broken locks. Just the absence of a child and the terrible weight of something being deeply, horribly wrong. Panic erupted instantly. Margaret screamed for her husband, who rushed in and began tearing through the house, hoping somehow, impossibly, that Emily had just wandered off in the early morning hours. But she wasn't in the bathroom, or the kitchen, or any of the closets. The back door was locked. The windows shut tight. Within the hour, police were on the scene, and a community's peaceful illusion shattered. A little girl had vanished from her bed without a trace. The investigation began immediately, with flashing lights and the sound of police radios breaking the morning stillness. Detectives interviewed the frantic Reynolds family, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors, checking security lights and backyard fences. Search dogs were brought in, sniffing the perimeter of the house and nearby woods, but they picked up nothing beyond the yard's edge, as if Emily had simply vanished into thin air. Flyers with her photo were printed by the hundreds, showing her sweet smile and bright eyes, eyes that now haunted everyone who saw them. Leads began to trickle in, but none bore fruit. A neighbor thought she'd seen a shadowy figure near the Reynolds home around midnight, but the details were too vague to be useful. Another local reported a strange van parked near the elementary school the day before, but no one could trace the vehicle or its owner. Rumors began to swirl in town. Some thought it was a kidnapping, others whispered darker theories, but no evidence supported any single conclusion. Emily's parents, devastated and desperate, appeared on local news, pleading for help. "If you know anything," Margaret said through tears, "please come forward. Please help bring our little girl home." Weeks turned into months, and still, there was nothing. The police followed every tip, drained local ponds, and even consulted psychics when all logical paths went cold. But it was as if Emily had been erased. Her bedroom remained untouched, her drawings still taped to the wall, her toys neatly arranged, her toothbrush still in the holder. Her mother couldn't bear to move a thing. She would sit in the room some nights, rocking gently in the old chair in the corner, as if waiting for Emily to come back and crawl into her lap. Each day that passed made it harder to hope, but letting go felt like betrayal. The case, once urgent and loud, slowly faded into silence, becoming just another folder in the growing stack of unsolved disappearances. Years passed, and life in the Reynolds house moved forward in slow, reluctant steps. Margaret and her husband, Tom, never moved away, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. To leave the house felt like abandoning Emily all over again. So they stayed, anchored by grief and the faint, flickering hope that one day the front door might open and their daughter would walk through it. Friends and relatives encouraged them to pack up Emily's room, to let go, for the sake of healing. But Margaret refused. The door remained closed to guests, the room preserved exactly as it had been the night Emily vanished. Inside, time stood still. The small bed with its pink quilt was made carefully each week, the stuffed rabbit gently repositioned on the pillow. Her little shoes remained lined up at the closet door. Crayon drawings, smiling stick figures and crooked hearts, still clung to the walls with faded tape. A few dresses hung in the closet, untouched, the plastic covers from the cleaners still intact. Dust gathered despite Margaret's careful cleaning, but nothing was ever moved, nothing was ever thrown away. The room was a shrine, a time capsule of a life paused at 6 years old. For Tom, it was harder. He visited the room less and less, finding it too painful to face. His grief took the shape of silence, long hours spent in the garage or walking aimlessly around the block. But Margaret drew comfort from the stillness of the space. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she would sometimes talk aloud, telling Emily about the day, about what she and her father had eaten for dinner, about how the world had changed. The conversations gave her a fragile sense of connection, a thread she refused to let snap. Every holiday was a quiet ache. Birthdays were especially hard. Each year, Margaret baked a cake, placed a single candle on top, and sat in the room alone, whispering a wish for her daughter's return before blowing out the flame. To others, it seemed tragic, some even said unhealthy, but to Margaret, it was survival. As long as Emily's room remained untouched, as long as her memory filled the space like light in the morning, there was still hope. And for a mother without answers, hope was all she had left. It was early spring, just after Emily would have turned 15. The air outside was warming, the snow finally melted, and the sun shone through the windows a little longer each evening. Margaret had always dreaded this time of year. Birthdays were the cruelest reminders. Yet this year, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the light caught the dust in the hallway or the silence that clung to the house even more than usual. Whatever it was, Margaret found herself drawn to Emily's room with a new purpose, one she didn't fully understand. She decided, for the first time in nearly a decade, to clean the room more deeply. Not to erase anything, but to freshen it, to touch the things her daughter once held with more than just a feather duster. She moved slowly, almost reverently, lifting books, gently folding blankets, running her fingers along the edges of old toys. Each object was a memory, fragile and irreplaceable. At the bottom of a small toy chest by the window, nestled beneath coloring books and doll clothes, Margaret found something she hadn't remembered in years. A small, pastel-colored tape recorder with flower stickers peeling off the sides. It had been Emily's favorite toy for a while, something she'd carry around, pretending to be a reporter, or recording little songs and make-believe interviews. Margaret held it in her hands, surprised at the wave of emotion it stirred. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen it. It still had a tape inside, the old kind with a clear plastic case and the spools barely turning unless you helped them along. Curious, and with no particular expectations, Margaret crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the battery compartment. To her astonishment, there were still batteries inside, corroded, but in place. She replaced them with fresh ones from the kitchen drawer, her hands trembling slightly as she snapped the case shut. Then she pressed the small, faded, play button. At first, there was only static. The sound of dust and time. Then came a burst of familiar noise. Emily's voice, bright and playful, filled the room, as if no time had passed at all. "This is Emily, and I'm hiding under the blanket." She giggled. Margaret's heart seized in her chest. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. The voice was so clear, so alive, it made her eyes fill with tears. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, a fragment of the past come back to life. Then, unexpectedly, another voice emerged, low, unfamiliar, and distinctly adult. Margaret's eyes flew open. The smile that had formed on her lips vanished. She turned up the volume and leaned closer. Emily's voice again, but no longer giggling. Quieter. Nervous. "Why are we going in the dark?" she asked. And then, silence. Margaret sat frozen, her fingers clenched tightly around the recorder, as if her grip alone could force more sound from the tiny machine. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the faint whir of the tape spools winding to a stop. She rewound the tape with shaking hands, her thumb hesitating above the play button. She had heard it. She knew she had. Emily's sweet voice, older than a toddler's babble, but still young and soft, and then that man's voice. Calm, too calm. And that question, "Why are we going in the dark?" It wasn't part of a game. It didn't sound like make-believe. It sounded real. And it sounded wrong. She pressed play again, this time holding the recorder closer to her ear, as though she might catch a whisper she had missed. The static crackled, and Emily's giggle returned. "This is Emily, and I'm hiding under the blanket." Then a shuffle, a pause. A deeper breath. The faint creak of something, perhaps the mattress, or the floorboards. Then, faint but clear, a man's voice, "Shush. We're not going to wake anyone." His tone was smooth, quiet, like someone used to coaxing. Then Emily again, quieter now, almost like a whisper. "Why are we going in the dark?" Then the tape cut off with a hard click. Silence. As if the recorder had been abruptly stopped, or taken away. Margaret sat motionless. Her body was rigid, her heart pounding in her throat. It felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Her instinct screamed. This wasn't a random recording. It wasn't a child's game. It was a moment, real, terrifying, captured and forgotten until now. A fragment of the night her daughter vanished, buried inside a plastic toy and left untouched for nearly a decade. She replayed it again, and again, each time hoping to hear something more. A word, a clue, anything that might tell her who that voice belonged to. Questions swirled in her mind like a tornado. Who was the man? How did Emily record this? Why was the tape still there, hidden in a toy that no one had touched since that horrible morning? Margaret's mind began to spiral, but one truth anchored her: this was evidence. This wasn't just a memory or a ghostly echo. This was real. A piece of the puzzle. Something the police never had. Without hesitation, she wrapped the recorder in a dish towel and placed it gently inside an old shoebox. She carried it downstairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. She didn't call Tom right away. She didn't even sit down. She just stood in the kitchen, staring at the box, trying to calm the flood of emotions building inside her. Then, with a deep breath, she picked up the phone and dialed the police. For the first time in 9 years, Margaret Reynolds had something to say that might bring her daughter home. The police arrived within the hour, responding to Margaret's call with a mix of urgency and cautious skepticism. Cold cases rarely got revived, and when they did, it was usually because of a confession or a body, not a toy recorder dug out of a decade-old toy chest. Still, something in Margaret's voice over the phone had struck a nerve with the detective on duty. Maybe it was the clarity of her words, or maybe it was the hint of restrained desperation, but it was enough to get someone sent out that same day. Detective Lisa Harmon, who had just recently transferred to the department, was the first to respond. She was too young to have worked the original case, but she knew the name Emily Reynolds. Everyone in Fairview did. The disappearance had left a scar on the town, the kind that never truly healed. Harmon had read the file in training, seen the photos, heard the theories. She never thought she'd be walking into the Reynolds home years later, stepping over the same threshold that so many investigators once had. Margaret led her silently up the stairs and into the room. The moment Harmon stepped inside, she understood. It wasn't just preserved, it was sacred. She took in the untouched details, the coloring books on the nightstand, the small slippers tucked near the bed, the faint scent of lavender that somehow still lingered. Margaret offered her the shoebox with both hands, saying nothing, and Harmon accepted it like an artifact. They sat at the edge of the bed while the detective carefully removed the recorder and listened. The room filled again with the crackle of static, then the high, innocent giggle. "This is Emily, and I'm hiding under the blanket." A pause. Then the sound again, the man's voice. "Shish, we're not going to wake anyone." The detective froze. Her eyes flicked to Margaret, who was watching her closely. Then came Emily's soft question: "Why are we going in the dark?" And the tape cut off. Harmon didn't speak right away. She simply rewound it and played it again. And again. Each time, her brows furrowed a little deeper. Her fingers danced lightly over the recorder, instinctively trying to gauge the quality and depth of the voices. It wasn't much, but it was something. A voice, a tone, a phrase. Enough to raise new questions. She asked Margaret if the voice was familiar. Margaret said no, at least not consciously. But the moment she heard it, it made her stomach twist, as if some part of her had always known that a stranger hadn't taken Emily, but someone close. Someone trusted. The detective nodded slowly and said the words Margaret had waited nearly a decade to hear: "This could be real evidence." What followed was a flurry of renewed activity. The recorder was taken to the lab for forensic audio analysis. The tape was carefully extracted and digitized. Analysts worked to clean the noise, isolate the voices, and enhance any background sounds. A faint creak, a muffled shuffle, even the texture of silence became potential clues. Meanwhile, Harmon dove headfirst into the old case file, cross-referencing every person who had ever been questioned, every name ever mentioned. Because if Emily had recorded that man's voice, it meant she had been with him willingly, at least at first. That changed everything. The story wasn't just about a child stolen in the night. It was about someone who had walked into her room, spoken softly, and led her away in the dark. And now, they finally had a way to find him. The digitized tape quickly became the centerpiece of the reopened investigation. Forensic audio specialists worked tirelessly, running the recording through advanced filtering software to strip away the background noise and enhance even the faintest trace of sound. Every crackle, every breath, every subtle shift in tone was scrutinized with meticulous care. They looped the segment where the man spoke, "Shish. We're not going to wake anyone," dozens of times, comparing it to archived voice samples of individuals interviewed in the original case. Meanwhile, Detective Harmon pored through stacks of dusty files, revisiting every name that had even briefly surfaced during the initial investigation. She was convinced the answer had been buried in the old case all along, waiting for someone to listen closely enough. While the investigation picked up speed behind the scenes, Margaret and Tom were thrust into a storm of old emotions. The quiet ache that had dulled with time was now raw again, open and fresh. Margaret found herself pacing the house at night, unable to sleep, clutching a copy of Emily's last school photo like it was a lifeline. Tom, who had always buried his pain in silence, began talking again, mostly to Margaret, sometimes to the detectives, and once, when he thought no one was listening, to Emily's empty room. A week after the tape was digitized, Harmon received a call from the lab. The audio team had isolated a background noise, faint but distinct, just before the tape cut off. A metallic clank, followed by what sounded like the slow squeal of a hinge. Not a door hinge, but something heavier. Possibly a car trunk, or the latch of a shed. More importantly, the lab had also analyzed the male voice's vocal patterns and tonal frequency. There wasn't enough for a full match, but they could build a voice profile. Harmon cross-referenced this profile against the recorded interviews from 1991 and filtered out anyone who had been cleared with alibis. Only a handful remained. Among them was a man named Douglas Hartley, a distant cousin on Tom's side, who had once lived nearby and frequently visited during family gatherings. He had volunteered during the initial search and had even walked the woods behind the Reynolds house with other volunteers. He was never considered a serious suspect, he had no criminal record, no history of violence, and had given a cooperative statement to police. But one thing stood out in Harmon's review: his voice. On his old tape-recorded interview, there was a warmth to his tone, a softness. It sounded eerily familiar. Harmon requested a new interview. Hartley, now living 2 towns over, agreed without hesitation. He smiled politely, claimed to remember little of that time, said he was shocked the case was reopened. But when Harmon played the clip, the part where the man said, "Shish. We're not going to wake anyone," something in his demeanor shifted, almost imperceptibly. His smile faltered, just for a second. His eyes flicked to the tape recorder on the desk. He didn't speak, and he didn't ask to hear it again. Instead, he shifted in his seat and glanced at the door, like he was already planning his next move. Harmon noticed. She didn't press him further, not yet. Instead, she thanked him for his time and watched as he walked calmly to the parking lot. Then she turned to the officer beside her and said quietly, "Put a tail on him. Don't let him out of your sight." The voice on the tape wasn't just a ghost from the past anymore. It had a name, and Detective Harmon was certain that Douglas Hartley knew exactly what had happened to Emily Reynolds. Surveillance on Douglas Hartley began that same afternoon. He lived alone in a modest, aging bungalow on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown hedges and a dilapidated wooden fence. His neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, perhaps a bit withdrawn, but no one had ever suspected anything sinister. He worked part-time as a groundskeeper at a local cemetery, a job that suited someone who preferred solitude. For 2 days, Hartley followed his routine without deviation: early morning walks, short drives to the store, afternoons tending graves. But on the 3rd night, something changed. At around 11:20 p.m., he left his house wearing dark clothing, got into his pickup truck, and drove out to an old property once owned by his late uncle, an unused hunting cabin nestled deep in the woods, a place that hadn't been visited in years. He parked at the edge of the tree line and disappeared into the shadows. The detectives following him waited, watching. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When Hartley re-emerged, he was carrying a large plastic storage bin. He loaded it into the back of the truck and began driving again, this time heading away from town. Detective Harmon, who had been monitoring the updates from her office, ordered the team to intercept him. They pulled Hartley over on a deserted stretch of road just past midnight. When questioned, he claimed he was cleaning out old family property and disposing of trash. But something about his voice, his calm tone, the same calmness heard on the old tape, sent a chill through Harmon. She asked to inspect the bin. At first, he resisted. Then, realizing he was outnumbered and under suspicion, he relented. Inside were various items: blankets, old tools, a few decaying boxes of toys, and among them, a faded pink backpack with peeling cartoon stickers and a broken zipper. Harmon reached in slowly and turned it over. Inside were children's drawings, some with Emily R. written in large, looping letters. A pair of dusty sneakers, clearly a child's size, tumbled out next. Hartley said nothing. He didn't run. He didn't cry. He simply stared at the road, as if it stretched back into a past he could no longer escape. He was taken into custody immediately. Over the next 48 hours, under pressure and confronted with mounting evidence, Hartley broke. He confessed to taking Emily that night in 1991. He had entered the Reynolds home through a side window he knew was faulty. He'd seen it during family barbecues in the backyard. He said he hadn't meant to hurt her. He told her they were going on an adventure. He admitted to speaking softly so as not to wake anyone. He didn't plan it, he claimed. It just happened. When asked what happened after the tape cut off, his voice grew thinner. He said Emily had grown scared. That she cried and asked for her mother. That he panicked. He refused to say more. The confession was incomplete, but it was enough. Based on his statements, the search of the cabin site was intensified. There, in a shallow, long-forgotten grave beneath the floorboards, forensic teams discovered partial remains. DNA testing confirmed what Margaret had always feared, yet never fully accepted: Emily Reynolds would never come home. The news broke the town. For Margaret and Tom, there was no sense of victory. Only a hollow kind of closure. The mystery that had haunted them for 9 years had been solved by a forgotten toy left beneath other memories, an accidental witness to a crime too carefully buried. Margaret kept the recorder, not as a keepsake, but as a symbol. It had carried her daughter's voice across time. It had spoken what Emily couldn't. It had given the little girl one final chance to be heard. And in the end, that voice had led them to the truth.